Давайте, может, мы попросим тогда кого-то еще раз прочесть нам стихи 49-50 вместе. Ну, например, вот вас, отец Ириней, по-гречески. И потом посмотрим на их русский перевод, постараемся понять, а что делают эти стихи здесь, в конце 9 главы. Отец Ириней, вы с нами?
Да-да-да-да, нажал на кнопочку. Читаю 49-50 стихи на греческом языке. Если позволите, я тогда читаю в рейхленном произношении или мне в Эразмовом прочитать, как лучше, по-древнегречески или по-византийски?
Как вам удобнее?
Хорошо. Пасгар пери алисфесетай, калос тоаллас, андо тоаллас,
Колонн.
э, алон, аналон.
Колонн.
Так, колон, да, колон тоалас, андо алас, аналон генисте. Entine αυτό αρτήσετε, έρχεται εν αυτής, αλλά και ειρηνεύεται εν αλλήλους. Мгм.
Окей. Мне кажется, немножко ваше произношение колебалось между двумя разными нормами.
Да, прошу прощения.
Вот.
Пюри вместо пири, да, и так далее.
Хорошо.
Мгм.
Но мы не будем сейчас на этом зацикливаться.
Да.
Ибо всякий будет приправлен огнем, как солью.
Мгм.
Э, Понимаете, буквально, ну, как скажем, и в синодальном переводе сказано, ибо всякий огнем осолится, да,
Мгм.
пюри огнем, как инструментом, галистес этой будет посолен. Я пытался сделать текст чуть-чуть более осмысленным, но я не знаю. Давайте сейчас посмотрим, насколько корректно было такое понимание. Это одна вещь про соль, одно изречение про соль. Соль хорошая вещь, но если она перестанет быть соленой, чем сможете вы ее посолить? Второе изречение про соль. Третье изречение про соль. Имейте соль в себе и будьте в мире друг с другом. Я даже попробовал сделать этот текст чуть-чуть синтаксически более параллельным. Две половинки строки 50Б. Имейте соль в себе и мир между собой. I think there are several questions which we can address ourselves when speaking about these three sayings. The first question is whether they have anything in common with each other except just the keyword soul.
Yeah, I think the answer is no.
And the second question is whether they have anything in common with the context.
I mean, yes, I mean, obviously from the context in verse 49, it seems to me that the context is negative and that salt is an image for the judgment that has been spoken of in the previous verses. But then all of a sudden, in verse 50, kalon tohalas, salt is good, and you should have salt in yourselves. And but this more positive view of salt you see developed more in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew. right? Where you are the salt of the earth. And so salt becomes an image for the Christians and for their preserving effect on humanity. So, I mean, salt is an image that can be used in different ways. And I think probably the best hypothesis is that Mark has, or maybe the tradition before him has different sayings about salt, and that they have been combined here, but it produces a text that has some very sudden turns that are really hard to understand. I mean, verse 49 goes with everything that precedes, but then all of a sudden you're talking in a much more positive way at the end of the discourse in verse 50.
Yes, but what can be the meaning of what kind of link is there between verse 49 and the previous text? First of all, we have here pas in Greek, всякий, everyone.
Yeah.
So this salt is being added not to those who are sinners, which may be just a continuation of the picture of verse 48, which speaks about the eternal punishment. Eternal punishment is scolex and pure and hals somehow, but here we have pas.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I mean, you could understand the pas as referring to all those of the group that has been just described, all those who, offend against the little ones. Um, but you could also, I guess, because of what follows, um, say that it's not supposed to be restricted, and that maybe it's talking about a double judgment, a negative judgment on those who offend, and then maybe implying a positive effect on those who do not offend and who are members of the group. But then verse 50 doesn't really, the eschatological context is not so clear there, and seems to be talking about present life. So again, there's a switch in the discourse. And I I I guess I'm not sure that it makes sense to try to look for a coherent line of thought in these two usages of salt. Or, I mean, one can try, but I'm not sure if one will succeed.
Okay, what I think about when I look at these verses is that in the Old Testament we have at least one place where which may have some connection to this. You shall not omit from your grain offerings the salt of the covenant with your God. With all your offerings you shall offer salt. וכל קורבן מנחתך במלח תמלח. It's a reference to salt. And also, it's a very rare case where the verb, which is derived from the noun salt melech, is also used. Bamelech timlach.
Well, and you do have you have two words, one after the other, that both refer to salt, and that's similar in the Mark, about if the halas becomes analon. So that's, linguistically a little bit similar to the infinite absolute plus the finite verb, bamelech timlach.
Yes. And we also have in Greek, kai pandoron, sius imon hali alistesetai.
Yeah.
We have at least two key words from Leviticus in Mark. Pas, which refers to pandoron thesius, and halistesetai, which is not only the same verb, but also the same form in the Septuagint.
Okay. So then how do we apply this to the Markan passage, that those who are being judged are somehow a sacrifice? They will, there will be a big burning in the judgment, and the wicked will be consumed, but somehow that's a good thing because it's a sacrifice. I guess would be one possible way of putting that together, though it's a rather unpleasant thought.
Yes, this is one. I do not know what can we do with this parallel with Leviticus, but I'm sure that the parallelism between this place in Leviticus and the Septuagint of Leviticus and our Markan text is too close. We must at least try to understand what can we do with this. Probably the negative understanding of 9:49 is caused exactly by its place in the Gospel of Mark. But
yes, I mean, you do have, later on, and already in 1045, you have the idea of Jesus as a sacrifice, right? But this is the only place in the gospel that I know of where you have the idea of other human beings functioning as a sacrifice somehow. If the idea is meant to carry over here.
yes, but also if the idea seems to be that of a sacrifice, but what kind of sacrifice is meant here? If we look at the usage of pure in the Gospels, we have, for example, in Matthew, saying about the future coming of the Son of the future coming of the Messiah, which humas baptisei and pneumati hagio kai puri. It seems that here the reference is not to sinners, but rather to those who would like to enter the kingdom of the Messiah.
Yeah, that's possible, although it's possible that in Matthew 3:11, there's two sorts of faiths that are envisaged. One is being baptized by the Holy Spirit, and the other is being baptized by fire. So it could, I think it's safe to say that most of the references to fire in the New Testament are negative and, have to do with the idea of a negative eschatological judgment. But I admit Matthew 3:11 is, it's debatable.
That's true, of course. But also, you have sayings like,
Building Babylon, Tower of Babel with bricks burnt with fire.
yes,
It's interesting that there are so many negative usages of fire in Matthew. Matthew, has much more about eschatological judgment in a negative sense than the other gospels.
but also, what should we do with this saying from Luke? Pure alton balein epitangan, kaititelo ed anefte.
Yeah, I mean, it's also very,
Is it also the eschatological judgment?
yeah, maybe. I mean, it's also a very difficult one because there's no really illuminating context. Jesus has, but it seems to link Jesus with the judgment. Whether or not that's positive or negative isn't clear from that passage in Luke. I don't think Luke likes the idea of judgment as much as Matthew does.
Yes, Luke is a humanist, of course.
He's more humanistic, yeah.
It's interesting. For decades, I read this Markan, this Matthew saying that Messiah will baptize or wash people with the Holy Spirit and fire. But I was also always thinking that these are two references to something the same, to the same thing, to the same kind of baptism or washing. You think that here in Matthew, especially take into account the negative associations that are so prominent in the Gospel of Matthew, the regard to fire in other places. This speaks about true ways.
Yeah, you could very well interpret it in terms of two ways. I mean, this saying it's a Q saying. It's also in Luke. And some have suggested that the Holy Spirit and fire is a hendiades, so it wouldn't be two ways. It would be two ways of saying the same thing.
Yes, that's because we have in Acts, for example, the image of Holy Spirit who comes down on the disciples like fire.
Right.
Los Jose Piros. And this is exactly the moment when, according to the theology of Luke, Holy Spirit comes and descends on the disciples.
Yeah, that would be part of the case for taking it as a hendiades in Matthew 3:11. So I mean, it depends so much on the context, and the context in Mark, is ambiguous, depending on whether you're looking back to what precedes or forward to what follows, because the passage ends up, in a very positive way.
Okay, so if this is a reference to the sacrifice, I try to follow your line of reasoning with regard to two different interpretations of the same image of fire. On the one hand, we have a sacrifice, a self-sacrifice of Jesus, and the life of his followers also can be understood as a kind of sacrifice. And in this case, this fire is also related to the Holy Spirit, and everyone will be to everyone this salt will be added, the Holy Spirit will be added, and the role of salt here is fire. But on the other hand, those who are doomed, they will also be part of sacrifice, like in the Old Testament we have the image in Isaiah, as far as I remember, the image of the wicked king.
Yeah.
For whom his fire awaits him. Wait a second, that's...
Yeah, I think maybe Isaiah 9, is that?
Yes, Isaiah 9, but what I had in mind was another
10, maybe.
passage. Probably it was not, there was no, pure is not mentioned here in the Septuagint. In Hebrew, this is the fire, tofto, is being mentioned. Okay, but in any case, we have a lot of case in the Old Testament where fire is an image of judgment. But I also wanted just to say that if we have in Matthew and in Luke this image of fire and spirit as a kind of hendiadys, which may be supported by the image of the Pentecost in the Acts, then even the first of the three sayings we're looking at now, even the first is not so unambiguously negative.
Yeah. I think, yeah, I mean, you could imagine this, like the same salt being applied to everybody and having, on those who are elect, it has a positive effect, and on those who are not elect, a negative effect. I imagine this is like a science fiction movie. I think you used to have a graduate student who was studying Bible, but also science fiction. And I can imagine this happening in a science fiction context. The same kind of, it depends on the person, what the person is bringing to this salting, whether the person survives and thrives or is burned up.
Okay, in this case, pass really refers to everyone, both to sinners and to elected ones. But the effect of pure would be different for two groups.
Seems to me that's possible.
Okay. This problem makes the passage, the movement of thought between 49 and other two sayings about salt a bit smoother. If already in 49 pure and salt have also positive connotations. Okay.
I mean, it does make you wonder, though. I mean, did Mark's readers, did they have enough context that they would be able to make sense of this? I mean, we've been talking about it for half an hour, and maybe we've come up with some sort of solution, but how can you could he expect, and if so, how could he expect his readers to understand this, or did he expect that? Or is it just some sort of collection, these come down as words of Jesus, and they're so precious because they're words of Jesus that we just like throw them all in at the end of this passage? I mean, that's the
Yes.
sort of thing that I wonder about, and there's no way of knowing what the answer is.
Окей. У нас же есть какие-то вопросы по отношению к соли? Кто-нибудь что-нибудь хочет сказать? Маша, вы ничего не хотите сказать про соль нам?
Я вот единственное, что хочу сказать, что очень хочется в форме галистес этой увидеть какую-то неправильную форму от глагола галиско. Галискумай. Но, наверное, это глупо. Или, по крайней мере, какую-то игру на этом значении.
Лариса, у вас нет? Я вижу, что вы подняли руку.
Да, но до меня отец Ириней поднял руку.
Окей. Тогда, отец Ириней, вам слово.
Да, спасибо. У меня вопрос, конечно, к 49 стиху и в отношении его перевода, потому что, судя по лаконичности греческого текста, речь идет о том, что, собственно, огонь будет солью. То есть мы буквально солим огнем, насколько я понимаю, роль здесь глагола и существительного. То есть не просто приправлен огнем как солью, а огонь и есть эта самая соль. Иными словами, здесь, возможно, есть та игра, что соль– это огонь. И, соответственно, если у человека нет соли, то у него нет огня. Он изнутри не горит, и перед нами тогда есть некое противопоставление, с одной стороны, адского огня, в котором очень плохо, и с другой стороны, соль, как внутренний огонь, которая вещь добрая. Не
Очень
знаю.
хорошо. Отец Ириней, и как бы это приложили сказать по-русски?
Но я бы все-таки как в синодальном здесь оставил бы. Огнем осолиться. Осолиться огнем. Тут и
Да.
лаконичность вместо 4 слов и предлога мы употребляем 2 слова. Ибо всякий осолится огнем. И все. Ну, как мы, как вот просили сказать что-то, я решил сказать.
Хорошо.
Спасибо.
Спасибо. Ларис, теперь вам слово.
Я хотела бы сказать по поводу перевода «приправлен». В общем, приправа– это то, что добавляется в небольшом количестве и придает какой-то вкус, там, пикантность или что-то. Вот. Но очевидно, что огонь действует не так, что это скорее, ну, я не знаю, будет засыпан огнем, как солью, или, ну, вот, в общем, это что-то поглощающее, а не добавляющее.
Либо всякий будет огнем посолен.
Да, наверное, или даже засолен, засолен.
Нет, ну, все-таки у нас засаливают скорее огурцы. Вот. А пищу, которую кладут на стол, скорее посолили. Окей. Ваше замечание в таком случае совпадает с предложением отца Иринея.
И мне кажется, что посолен с точки зрения идеи того, что сверху падает на нас соль, ну, есть смысл, потому что действительно, с одной стороны, засолить– это пропитать солью, и мы должны быть пропитаны солью. Но ассоциация с огурцами, она настолько устойчивая, что слово «засолиться» уж мы представим себе, как помидорчики, огурчики в банке плавают. А вот посолен, тут и благодать, которая сверху падает, мне кажется, это ближе к ветхозаветному пониманию того, что сверху все хорошее, и дождь сверху падает, и солнце сверху светит, и,
Да.
соответственно, соль
Э,
сверху.
Опять же, и огонь, и сера тоже сверху падает.
Да, 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 да.
Хорошо, отец Дмитрий, и вижу, у вас тоже поднята рука.
Да, я просто оператора согласился бы с тем, что слово «приправленный» действительно означает какую-то малую добавку. Вот, но, собственно, почему я поднимал руку, может быть, говорили уже в прошлой встрече, что этот стих имеет, по крайней мере, 3 варианта в рукописях. Вот, и осоление жертвы, там, это один из текстуальных вариантов, причем в кодексах. Вот. И есть даже вариант, где всякие осолится вообще не опущено, только всякая жертва солью солится. Вот, то есть очевидно, что если даже это первоначальный вариант, вот краткий, который в Нест-Галленде, вот он с глубокой древности ассоциируется вот именно с жертвоприношением, которое солится. По всей видимости, это единственное толкование, которое приходило в голову переписчикам.
Ну да. Окей.
Простите, можно я тоже добавлю?
Да.
Мне кажется, не то, что ты вам сказала. Я имела в виду, нет ли здесь игры с глаголом «еласкумай», соответственно, с формой «еластесатой», которая бы по смыслу здесь очень хорошо подошла, что каждый огнем будет искуплен, очищен. Я не знаю, как это можно осмыслить, но мне кажется, что
Но у нас есть примеры такого рода игры еще.
не знаю. Ну ладно, я не предлагаю долго об этом думать, просто я хотела поделиться своим соображением.
Ну да. Окей, хорошо. Тогда, потому что мы видим, что у нас здесь соль оказывается двусмысленной во всех трех наших изречениях. И тогда, отец Дмитрий, вы больше чего хотите сказать, а? Потому что я вижу вашу руку поднятую.
Нет, я, наверное, просто не убрал.
Да,
Извините.
это надо и убрать.
Ага. Простите.
Окей. Что ж, тогда переходим к следующей части. Вот. Три достаточно энигматических действительно, изречения. Потому что какое отношение имеет также соль и мир, параллель между которыми как-то подразумевается в самой последней строке. Тоже не очевидно. Словно бы наш евангелист под конец 9 главы постарался собрать все имевшиеся в его распоряжении изречения, которые, с одной стороны, имеют отношение к соли, а с другой стороны, каждое по-своему энигматично. Хорошо. Тогда что, мы переходим к следующей части, к следующей перекопе. Если больше нет замечаний, тогда мы просим Елена, может быть, вас мы попросим прочесть первый стих, а потом дальнейшее развитие событий.
Мгм.
Елена, вы с нами?
А вы мне говорите? Но я не умею на греческом читать, к сожалению. Я могу
Я,
только на
я-
русском.
спасибо, нет. Я имел в виду Елену Репустину,
А, тогда хорошо.
но Елена сейчас исчезла. Хорошо. Маша, тогда давайте, может быть, вы прочтете нам греческий текст следующего стиха.
Хорошо, а вы выведете на экран?
Да, сейчас ввожу.
А могу ли я, как самовыдвиженец, предложить свою кандидатуру, чтобы вы меня подправили, а я попытаюсь исправить свою ошибку в произношении?
Ну хорошо, отец Илья, если вы так
А,
настаиваете, то мы не можем отметать добровольцев. Вот. Но
спасибо
только
большое.
тогда вы читаете
В
весь
одной
текст.
парадигме, да.
Давайте мы выберем тогда Эразмову парадигму, чтобы ваша парадигма не отличалась
Давайте, да.
от всех остальных. И тогда вы эту Эразмову парадигму артикулируете предельно четко.
Мгм. Kai ekeiten anastas erchete estagoria tes Eodeas, kai peran tu Iordano, kai simporeontai palin ochli pros auton, kai gos eothei palin edidas ken autus.
Окей. Все равно до конца выдержать одно чтение вам не удалось. Но давайте перейдем к русскому тексту. Оттуда он направился в иудейские земли и в Заиорданье. Снова за ним следовали толпы народа, и он снова, как обычно, учил их. Но насчет перевода Кейтона как оттуда, наверное, проблем нету. Дальше вопрос в том, что он делал тем самым Анастас. Вот это, конечно же, в конечном счете отражает еврейскую идиому вояком воелях. Тогда, когда у нас говорится про то, что какой-нибудь ветхозаветный герой куда-то отправляется, то он встает и идет, или встает и едет. Не обязательно считать, что в данном случае Марк жил внутри семитоязычного мира, потому что он вполне мог просто-напросто заимствовать эту идиому из Септуагинты, поскольку уже язык Септуагинты становится, в том смысле слова, сакральным для грекоговорящих иудеев, то мы понимаем, что стандартный способ сказать, что кто-то куда-то пошел, Анастас Эрхетай. Вот я не знаю, на самом деле, это вопрос скорее переводческий. Вот такого рода не идиоматические для греческого языка штучки должны мы передавать в нашем русском тексте? В синодальном варианте, мне кажется, давайте посмотрим. В синодальном варианте, даже в синодальном варианте, сейчас, это Анастас опускается, отправившись оттуда. Но вот в церковнославянском варианте, небось, есть. Лариса, правильно?
Я сейчас посмотрю.
We are discussing the expression Anastas Erchetai.
Vayakum Vayomer.
Yes. Vayakum Vayomer, Vayakum Vayelech, Vayakum Vayered, Vayakum Vayal, и так далее. And so on.
I mean, the other idiomatic things that's important to discuss is he goes beyond the Jordan.
Yes.
In which direction? Right? Because generally, so maybe we'll come back to that, right? Because generally you think beyond the Jordan is from the Israeli point of view, like over in the country of Jordan now.
Yes.
But if you're already on the other side of the Jordan, then beyond the Jordan would be back on the Israeli side.
Yes, and of course the problem of whether we should read this sky here or whether we shouldn't is a big question. But usually we decided to start discussing every verse with more simple questions related to translation than to proceed to more important questions related to the history of the verse.
But nothing is simple in biblical studies.
Yes. So just wanted to address our colleagues. What should we do with such Septuagintisms or Semitisms in the language of Mark? Should we try to imitate this in our translation, just to show that this was a text a bit strange for normal Greek ear, or it would be too much to render such Anastas Archetai?
And how do you do it in your translation for right now?
I omitted it.
Oh, okay. That's one solution.
В славянском
Yes.
есть.
Что?
В славянском есть. И оттуда восстав, приди в пределы иудейские.
Окей. Вот. Но русскоязычные коллеги, что нам делать с этим самым восстав здесь? Когда я переводил еврейский Ветхий Завет, у меня не было ни малейшего сомнения в том, что нужно делать, потому что это еврейская нормальная идиома. Вот. И переводить еврейскую нормальную идиому воеком воелях двумя словами по-русски, это прям столь же осмысленно, как, там, не знаю, пытаться передавать какие-то особенности еврейской идиоматики или еврейского спряжения. Вот. Но здесь эта вещь для греческого чужая. Должны ли мы передавать ее инаковость или нет? Что скажете, русскоязычные коллеги? Кто за то, чтобы, вот как это в тексте у нас сейчас переводы есть, не заморачиваться с переводом этого Анастас? Поднимите руки. Отец Ириней. Слава, Маша, Лариса. А кто за то, чтобы попробовать передать этот семитизм или септуагинтизм? Okay. We solved at least the minor problem, namely whether to render or not to render this Semitism in this verse. And now we can proceed to the more important and more difficult problem, namely what to do with geography of this passage. Yes. Сейчас виден текст, да? Окей. Потому что буквально мы здесь видим, что сейчас. Буквальный текст. Иисус идет в Иудею за Иорданом или в Иудею и земли за Иорданом. Видите, то, что у нас Кай взято в квадратной скобочке, показывает, что для издателя вероятность того, что это Кай подходит к первоначальному тексту, было 50-50.
Ну, здесь, по всей видимости, потому что без Кай чтение намного более трудное, потому что основные рукописи дают Кай. И Синайские, и Ватиканские кодексы.
Ну да.
Из этих соображений, конечно, Кай можно было бы спокойно оставить и не волноваться по этому поводу. Но, видимо, думают, что раз трудное чтение, то мучают нас буквой С.
Да, но параллельное, если я правильно понимаю, у нас есть a parallel passage из Matthew 19:1. Гένто хоте ετέλεσεν ο Ιησούς τους λόγους τούτους, μετέρεν από τες Γαλιλαίας, και έλθεν εις τα γόρια της Ιουδαίας πέραν του Ιορδάνου. This is the same story in the plot of Matthew. This is exactly the same point as this verse takes in Mark. Should we understand Matthew as a later Matthew's reading as a later reading aimed at taking out the strange Kai?
Yeah, you know, in cases like this, you always wonder, is Matthew giving you his understanding of what Mark, his source, said, or is he correcting his source? But so, yeah, here at least the way Matthew takes it, is again as a hendiades, right? So that you know, this beyond this Transjordan area is part of Judea.
Yes, whichever way we take this, with Kai or without Kai, it's a geographical nonsense. Because if Kai is there, then we have a very strange depiction of Jesus going from Galilee to two regions which are quite distinct from each other. If we take this Kai out, then we have a very strange description of Judea.
Yeah, unless he's, you know, like a proto-Likud Netanyahu type, you know, where he thinks that the Transjordan is also part of historical Judea. But more seriously, again, it could be, you know, in the narratives of the conquest, they're coming in from the east, and so from that vantage point, Transjordan area could be Judea. If you're coming in from the east rather than looking at it from the west bank of the Jordan.
Yes, in the for example, in Deuteronomy 11, we have this expression parent to Iordano, referring not to something which is placed to the east of Jordan, but to something that is placed to the west of Jordan. Of course, this may go well with the idea that Matthew was written somewhere to the east of Jordan, so that parent to Iordano for Matthew and his audience was Judea proper, the land to the west of Jordan. But this is a bit too bold.
Yeah, I like that. That's a good observation. I guess the other thing I would be looking at, and I can't remember what the details are, but you know, where has Jesus been right before this, and where is he right after this? And before this, the geographical indications are pretty vague, because he was up on, well, in 933 he's in Capernaum. So I guess that's the last geographical indication that you had in the story before this. And after this, let's say, I mean, so yeah, after this, you don't have anything until, you know, much later in the story. In 1032, they're on the road going up to Jerusalem, but it doesn't tell you from where. But one presumes that it's from somewhere within Judea. And this also becomes relevant because, I mean, well, let me leave strike that. Anyway, you have to look at where in the context they are. At least that it seems to me that's relevant for this question.
Okay. Were you in the editorial committee of the Greek New Testament? Would you vote for Kai or against Kai in Mark?
I don't know. I don't have the textual evidence here in front of me. I should, but let's see, which is the more, I would think, that I think you could easily understand adding the Kai as a scribal amelioration, because Judea beyond the Jordan, might have struck a scribe as not making much sense. So I would think it's more likely that a scribe would add the Kai than that the Kai was present and for some reason dropped out.
Okay. I can show you the textual evidence. And that's the database variations in the Greek New Testament.
Okay, so the Kai, so the inclusion of the Kai is in Sinaiticus and Vaticanus.
Yes.
So, that's pretty good. So where is it lacking? But it's lacking, oh, well,
it is lacking in Codex Ephraemi.
I mean, it says lacunae P45, P84, but does that mean that the whole expression is lacking, or?
Yes. This means that, unfortunately, the most important and interesting papyri witnesses
don't have it.
Which help us, yes. They do not vote either for or against.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I don't know. I'd have to study the evidence, but I think just in terms of internal logic, it strikes me as more likely that Kai was added to make sense of an expression more like what you have in Matthew, so that Matthew is kind of reconstructing or has some knowledge of some other form of this that doesn't have the Kai. But I'm not sure.
Okay, so this may be treated either as one more indication that Mark didn't know the geography of the southern Levant quite well, or as an indication if it was Mark who first wrote Judea Paran to Erdano, then I don't remember. I don't remember.
Yeah, then Mark may have been in Syria also.
What in what area did you place Mark and his community?
I mean, I think I like Syria as a possibility. So that would make sense, for Mark and his community also.
Syria, in the broadest way, the Roman province Syria, including Judea and so on, or Syria in a more narrow sense, like Damascus and the areas to the north of Damascus.
I guess I was thinking of Damascus or Antioch, somewhere to the east of the Jordan. And I mean it, and it was partly just because it seemed to me that the war, of AD 70 is very important for Mark, and of course that was known all over the Jewish world, but the effect would have been most immediate, in closer to Palestine, but in a Greek-speaking area.
And where do you see indications of the war in Mark, of the war of 70?
Well, for example, in chapter 13 and all the eschatological stuff.
So you think that this eschatological material is sort of pacisinum ex eventu. So it testifies that Mark was written after all this happened.
Yeah, and for example, in chapter 13, he says, there will be a time of trouble such as has never been from the beginning. And I think that Mark, I thought when I was writing my commentary that Mark and his community think that's what we're living through. We're living through this time of thlipsis, of great tribulation. But it's all very speculative, I have to say. I mean, the one thing that you can say is that the later Gospels, Matthew and Luke, you get more exact, like especially in Luke, descriptions of Jerusalem surrounded by armies and then destroyed. So that definitely seems ex eventu. And with Mark, it's not so exact, but it seems like he has the war in view and he's very concerned about
it. Okay. If we do not look at this strange expression, parent to Erdano or kai parent to Erdano, then the general plot and Jesus movement are quite understandable.
Let's say one other thing about this. I think there's similar expressions in before and after maybe the stories of the two feeding miracles. And, I came to the conclusion that the first feeding is in a Jewish area, and the second in chapter 6, the second in chapter 8 was in a non-Jewish area. But similar questions about, just all these movements of Jesus from one side of the Jordan to the other come into discussions about those two feeding miracles. And I think you may have similar ambiguities there, though I can't remember the details.
Okay, but in any case, the main movement is Jesus moving to Judea and to Jerusalem to meet his death and resurrection there. And on that way, a lot of things happen, including, of course, first of all, the three predictions, but also the development of the controversy between Jesus and his enemies.
Yes, and I also, there's a series of controversies, and but like in some of them, and I think others besides this one, Jesus is going to say something about the subject, about marriage, and then he's going to go aside with his disciples and give them further instruction. So that it's controversy, but it's also instruction to the disciples. There's a lot of teaching of the disciples in this whole area as he's going up to Jerusalem.
Yeah, but this is the same structure we met earlier many times, especially when we read the parables, that he says something to the general audience, and then tells his disciples some additional comments and remarks.
He gives private instruction. Yes, I think that's right. But I guess the reason I was mentioning it is because, the overall framework, he's going up to Jerusalem. He's meeting with opposition. He gets questions. He explains, and he then explains things to the disciples. And the whole thing is framed by these two stories of healing a blind man. So, which I think that's a very deliberate framing, that it's about moving the disciples from a status where they, see imperfectly to a status where they see more clearly. That's sort of the overall symbolism. Even though that sort of enlightenment is hard to trace in what happens to the disciples in the story, because they seem to just get stupider and stupider. But still, there's some sort of promise that if you pay attention, then your blindness will be healed. You'll be able to see Jesus more clearly, and you'll be able to follow him in the way.
Okay. By two stories that frame Jesus' way to Jerusalem, you mean the miracle in Bethsaida? That's what we're looking at now.
Yeah. And the miracle in Jericho with Bartimaeus in 1046 to 52.
So I think that these two miracles are quite deliberately placed before and after the way.
Right, and the first one happens right before the first prediction of the Passion, and the last one comes after the third prediction of the Passion. So Jesus is going up to Jerusalem to suffer, to die, and to be resurrected. And following him in that way of suffering, death, and resurrection is the way to become enlightened. I think, overall symbolically, that's what that structuring implies.
And after the second miracle, the blind man followed Jesus.
His blindness is healed and he follows. So there's a connection between having your blindness healed and following. Following is the context in which the illumination happens.
But the first story of healing a blind ends not with the blind man following Jesus, but rather with Jesus sending him back.
Right. But that first healing of blind man, before Jesus touches him a second time, he sees, but he doesn't see. Right? He sees, but he sees imperfectly, just like Peter immediately afterward sees that Jesus is the Messiah, but he doesn't understand that he's to be a suffering Messiah.
So there's a progression between the two stories of healing the blind man.
Right.
So that the second healing is somehow more effective, or how would you say?
It's more immediately effective. Yeah. I mean, the first healing is strange because, Jesus touching you should heal you. But he doesn't get it right the first time. But I think Mark preserves this story partly because he likes, this in between seeing and not seeing. I see men, but they look like trees. Imperfect sight corresponding to the imperfect sight of Peter, in that context.
Okay, I see.
But that's sort of the larger structure that.
I think we can read one more verse before we end our meeting of today. We have about 10 minutes. Лариса, прочтите нам второй стих по-гречески.
Да. Kai proseltontes farisaioi eperoton auton ei existin Andri gynaika apaliusai peiradzantos auton.
Да, к Иисусу подошли фарисеи и, желая его испытать, спросили его, можно разводиться с женой. The main problem here is that, as far as we know, problem not right. The only movement or sect or party within Judaism that in first century CE was insisting that one should not divorce his wife. The only party is the early Christians. As far, at least if we take the Sermon on the Mount literally. So the question is, what was the sense in Pharisees testing Jesus? If the question had been controversial within Judaism, then the testing would be quite understandable. They wanted to ask him whether he's on this or that side of this controversy. But if it wasn't uncontroversial, what is the sense? What this addition "peratsuntes auton" mean?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, from some later evidence in the Mishnah, there were disputes between House of Hillel and House of Shammai about the grounds for divorce, and House of Shammai.
Yeah, but that's what we have in Matthew.
Yeah,
it's a different story.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so he at least is aware of that. I think there's some passages in the Dead Sea Scrolls that forbid marrying two women in one's lifetime. And what that means is controversial. I mean, it may mean that if your wife dies, you can't remarry. But, and that is sometimes brought into discussion about this. But yeah, we know of no other Jewish group that forbade divorce. So, I mean, I guess you could fill this in by saying that people had heard that Jesus had a, rigorous view on divorce. And so they wanted to draw him out into the open and to ask him about the apparent contradiction between his teaching and the Torah, which seems to, just assume that divorce is going to happen. So you can fill in the backstory that way.
Okay.
I mean, at this point in the story, all of the discussions, or most of the discussions between Jesus and the Pharisees, are hostile. So it's all perazon. There's going to be a scribe later in this chapter who is not so hostile, I think. But most of the discussions are hostile.
Окей. Тогда, если говорить про русский вариант, то здесь он бы, не желая его испытать, it's not about testing. It's rather about provoking. They're not asking him about his position, but they want him to say something that would contradict the law of Moses. And probably,
perazon has a hostile context throughout the gospel. I think that's pretty consistent. It's not really probing, just for the purposes of coming up with information. It's probing in order to accuse.
Okay.
And the first instance of that verb is in the temptation narrative, where it's Satan who is perazon.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Можем по-русски сказать? И спросили его, провоцируя.
Можно, это будет точно.
Да.
Грамматически можно, но в переводе Евангелия это очень странно. Это искушая, если что, это оставаться в рамках.
Что значит искушая? Мне кажется, в русском языке выражение «искушай, не искушай меня без нужды» и прочее касается того, когда человеку предлагают что-то, вот какое-то такое, что-то такое соблазнительное.
Ну, такое тоже, конечно.
Что?
Да, есть, конечно, и такой смысл, да, когда что-то хорошее, такое, кажущееся хорошим предлагают. Нет, я так не веду такой. В словаре синодального перевода, по крайней мере, искушать, в общем, означает, в одном из значений означает провоцировать как раз.
Ну да.
Хорошо бы найти, конечно.
Пришли стали его провоцировать, спрашивая его, можно ли разводиться с женой. Вот так тогда.
А почему вы мужа пропустили, Михаил Георгиевич?
Можно ли? Ну, хорошо.
Но провоцировать, по-моему, даже и по смыслу, помимо того, что это регистр другой, даже и по смыслу. Все-таки это нечто другое.
Почему? Потом все, что они хотели, чтобы он сказал, что если верна, if we assume that the Pharisees knew that Jesus' position on divorce is different from the position of all other Jewish groups, and even from the literal understanding of the Torah, then definitely asking him this question would be a provocation, because they were trying to force him to openly disagree with Moses.
Yes, that makes sense. I mean, the same verb is going to be used later for the question about giving tribute to Caesar, though, that isn't as clearly a Torah question as this is.
Okay.
So provocировать. So that's like provoking him.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Ну что ж, давайте
That's
тогда
good.
сегодня перед тем, как... простите. Joel, since you know the route to provoke and you read the Russian text, you may also join our vote of Russian speakers. Кто за то, что поставить глагол провоцировать? Who is for putting provoking here?
А было испытуя?
Было что-то в этом роде. Не испытуйски, но скорее испытывая было.
Провок по-английски, видимо, вполне подходит. Вот русские все-таки другие коннотации.
Вот ощущение, что как-то по-русски это не очень хорошо стилистически, хотя по смыслу точно.
Лариса за и Слава за. А кто против провокации?
Мне как-то больше испытания нравится.
2 голоса против. Ну хорошо, подумаем.
Was someone provoking you by voting against? Or
Yes, some people provoke me by voting for, and some people provoke me by voting against provoking.
I see. Yeah. You call this damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Yes. Маша, а вы что скажете?
Я хотела спросить, есть ли у нас еще 5 минут на другой вопрос?
Okay, Joel,
Do we have
Маша,
another 5 minutes? Or should we leave other questions for next time?
I'm okay with a few more minutes, but
okay,
whatever you want to do. Yeah.
okay.
I just wanted to go back to salt. I'm sorry that I'm a bit slow. And ask whether this verse was connected with another place in Hebrew Bible where Galistesate is used. It's from Ezekiel about a newborn girl. It said that she was not salted by salt. It's usually interpreted as some sort of apotropaic ritual or hygienic procedure. So it's or both maybe. And we have another place in 2 Kings where also salt is used in a ritual for healing. Yeah, but not exactly for healing, but like in ritual purposes, but connected with healing. So
yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, so my idea is that maybe it would be interesting to look in this direction too, that it could be about some sort of apotropaic ritual with healing purposes.
Yeah. Well, and especially the first thing about, so this would be like some sort of birth ritual, right?
Yeah, birth ritual. Yeah, and it's can be somehow connected with baptism.
Yeah. Huh. I mean, because of course, so the context is eschatological, and the eschaton is about the death of one world and the birth of a new world. Yeah. So I could see that just in general terms, that might be relevant, that salt is connected with, a transition like that.
Yeah.
From one state of being to another.
Yeah, so in this case, everyone will be salted by fire, will be like, instead of salt in this ritual will be used fire, but then it's about using salt in this apotropaic ritual or association with this ritual.
Yeah. Oh, it's interesting. And I mean, I think I did read something when I was researching the passage about, if you have a fire going and you throw salt into it, then, it creates sparks. So, I mean, fire is powerful, and it's a powerful symbol of both of destruction, but also of refining and transforming. And, the difficulty is figuring out what it means in a particular passage, and the combination of salt and fire is also interesting. But yeah, those are interesting passages.
Yeah, but I mean that this connection with this ritual to which probably in Ezekiel refers, it would solve the problem of this transition from negative to positive.
How does it solve that problem?
Because in this case, at the end, salting somebody is a good thing, even if it's done by fire.
Yeah, okay.
I'd say it like this.
Okay. Don't try it on your own kids.
Yeah.
Without proper precautions.
Only on myself.
Yourself first, yeah.
At the end.
That's a very interesting passage, or a couple of passages.
Yes, I think it's interesting that in the perspective that Masha brought to our attention, salt accompanies one's entry into the world in the same way as baptism is a sign of one's entering into new life. And then we have a constellation of these images. Salt as a sign of entering new life, salt as a sign of baptism, baptism with Holy Spirit, and fire as a sign of Spirit. So these things turn out to be connected to each other.
Yeah, and I can't remember if there's like some evidence from 2nd century baptismal texts. I'm sure that there is sometimes reference to bread being consumed at baptism, and I'm not sure, but maybe there's occasionally reference to salt also included in that, but I can't remember.
Okay. So we opened a new can of worms related to the divorce. And we will continue this next Thursday.
Good. I'm going to go down to Chicago. I'm in Chicago, so.
Joel, I wanted to ask you about hurricane.
Oh yeah, I mean the hurricane didn't hit our part of the state.
Are you safe?
Yeah, it hit my state, but a couple hundred miles from me. So we weren't personally affected, but I know people, who have relatives in other parts of the state who were. Yeah, but it's pretty heavy hurricane. And it sort of disrupted the mail, for the whole state. And it's been pretty bad. And it'll take years, for people to recover, I think. But thank you for asking.
Yeah, I'm happy that you're safe.
Yeah. Okay. До свидания.
До свидания. Спасибо.
Спасибо, до свидания, всего доброго.
До свидания.
Bye.